Welcome to Historically Speaking. I'm Peter Laporte, your host for the St. Mary's County Historical Society. Once again, we're at this magnificent Pax River Naval Air Station Museum. Today we're sitting again with Bob Tourville. Bob is going to present to us a very interesting story about the Naval Air Station here in World War II. For those who may have missed your prior talk for the Historical Society, Pax River's Forgotten Cold Warriors, Bob, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your role here at the Air Museum?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Professionally, I retired a few years ago after about 35 years of doing engineering for the Naval Air Systems Command. But personally, I've been involved with or interested in aviation from really as far back as I can recall. I remember as a kid growing up outside a Strategic Air Command base, a very young kid, looking up at the airplanes flying overhead, wondering what they were, what the people inside those airplanes were doing. As I got a little bit older, you start reading a little bit and you start getting a little bit more savvy about what's happening on that air base at that point in time. And then I started getting interested in, well, what happened years earlier during World War II? And it sort of got me hooked on aviation history, particularly military aviation history, and I've sort of been obsessive compulsive with military aviation history ever since. So it's kind of a logical progression going from an interest in aviation to a career at Nav Air to now being a volunteer at the Pax River Naval Air Museum. And I've worn several hats over the past 4 or 5 years that I've worked here. For the first couple of years I was designing exhibits, I was generating signs, putting interpretational data together to help visitors understand the artifacts that we have in this museum.
Sure.
But for the last 2 years I've been very focused on doing historical research, specifically trying to delve into what the operational and test and evaluation flying units have been doing here at Pax River, really from the inception of the base in April of 1943 to now.
Terrific.
So the lecture you alluded to earlier, the Cold War lecture, and now this World War II film that we'll be showing today, that's partially a culmination of those efforts I've been doing over the last couple of years. And there's more it's still in the process.
And what led you to make this film about World War II, Bob?
Yeah, it's interesting. The answer is, I've talked to so many people since moving here in 1997, and I've walked away with a distinct impression that there are a number of folks in the community who don't really know all that much about what goes on at Pax River today, and know almost nothing about what took place here at Pax River 20 years ago, 30
Sure.
years ago, 70 years ago. Trying to fill that historical knowledge gap, to give people a sense of what this base has done. And really from two perspectives. One, the local perspective, obviously. I put myself in the head of a kid who was here in World War II for purposes of today's film, looking overhead, wondering what those airplanes are and what they're doing, trying to answer those questions. But also expanding the aperture a little bit and saying, why is that important? What was it the base was doing, not only here in the local community, but for the warfighting effort? And Pax River, as it turned out, I think a very significant role in America's warfighting effort during World War II. So I'm hoping to get all of that across to the viewers of this film today. And I think I'll be very interested in getting some feedback and seeing what people think about it.
This film will take us beyond what happened here at the Patuxent Naval Air Station and include Webster Field and other facilities in southern Maryland. Let's go right to the film.
We Americans sometimes recall World War II as something that happened over there, in European skies, on faraway oceans, above Asian mountains, and in African deserts. But all across this country, communities like ours played vital roles in the war effort. In this video, you'll learn about Southern Maryland's contributions. Military men and women came to Southern Maryland for various reasons. Some came here to test the aircraft and weapons that made U.S. naval aviation a dominant force. Others came here to transport people and supplies overseas, or to train gunners and aviators. But all came here to help secure victory. We hope you enjoy their story, a story of Southern Maryland. The story of naval aviation in Southern Maryland begins in Washington, D.C. at the former Naval Air Station Anacostia. From aviation's earliest days, Anacostia had been the site of the Navy's most important flight test operations. But by the late 1930s, Anacostia's limitations were becoming obvious. Located across the Potomac River from Washington National Airport, and in the middle of Washington's increasingly crowded airspace, Anacostia was no longer suitable for sensitive military testing. After quietly surveying multiple sites, the Navy announced its decision to relocate Anacostia's flight test groups to a rural location in St. Mary's County, Maryland. The impending move was made public as America was entering the Second World War. Construction at the southern Maryland site began immediately after the land was acquired, and the new Naval Air Station Patuxent River was commissioned on 1 April 1943. The base's first tenants were several of Anacostia's test units and a transport squadron, VR-1, from NAS Norfolk. In this video, we'll look at naval aviation flying units that operated from Webster Field and Solomons during the Second World War. But we'll begin our discussion with Pax River, and specifically with that base's test community. During the war, some 5 test divisions operated from Pax. Let's look at each one, starting with the Flight Test Division. Pax River's Flight Test Division was responsible for evaluating every new aircraft type and every major modification of existing aircraft types. The photos depict just a small sampling of the new aircraft assessed by flight tests during World War II. The principal focus of flight test was ensuring conformance with contractual requirements and the fleet's needs. One of this division's most important functions was identifying design deficiencies that required correction before the aircraft or modification could go to war. Formed from test units that had been based at NAS Anacostia and NAS Norfolk, flight tests came to Pax River within a few months of the base's commissioning in 1943. Among flight tests' many notable wartime activities was evaluating the first jet engine to be designed and produced in the United States. Here you can see that engine, the Westinghouse 19A Yankee, being tested under the belly of a Goodyear FG-1 Corsair in 1944. This film clip, also from 1944, shows the Flight Test Division evaluating the first U.S. jet airplane, the Bell XP-59 Aerocomet fighter. It may surprise you that the emergence of viable jet aircraft was no longer a closely guarded military secret at this time, as shown by the contemporaneous newspaper coverage of this event. The Flight Test Division's responsibilities included carrier suitability testing of all aircraft types, both new and modified, that were intended for use on aircraft carriers. Unique to naval aviation, carrier suitability testing is still performed today and covers a range of parameters. As these film clips suggest, carrier launches, approaches, and landings demand a robust airframe and responsive flight controls at low altitudes and airspeeds. Additionally, carrier aircraft must be fully compatible with all ship equipment. During the war, most carrier suitability testing was conducted right on the Chesapeake Bay using the carrier USS Charger. Based in the Chesapeake throughout World War II, Charger supported Pax River testing, along with the carrier qualification of pilots in fleet squadrons headed to war. Let's look next at the Tactical Test Division. The major responsibility of tactical test was to develop guidance for the fleet in how to best employ an aircraft or weapon in an actual combat environment. That function had originally been performed at NAS Anacostia, but came to Pax River a year after the base's commissioning. Within the Navy, tactical test often had the most thorough understanding of the various new systems being introduced to the fleet. Accordingly, personnel from this division frequently provided direct technical assistance to operational units preparing for war. For example, teams of men and aircraft from 2 Navy flying boat units received training at Pax River between September of 1943 and April of 1944. Although research is continuing, it's likely that these groups from Squadron VP-15 and Fleet Air Wing 5 came to Pax River to understand more about operating and maintaining the new radar and countermeasure systems being fitted to their flying boats. Similarly, a number of Marine Corps units also traveled to Pax River for technical training during the war. Marine Bombing Unit 61, Marine Air Group 62, Marine Operational Training Group 81, and Night Fighting Squadron VMB 612 all sent teams of men and Douglas PBJ bombers to Pax River. The War Diary of Bombing Squadron 117, or VB-117, provides a glimpse into the kind of assistance that tactical test personnel provided to the fleet. In July of 1944, Pax River's Tactical Test Division instructed VB-117 in the use of the APS-15 and APQ-5, radar systems that had recently been installed in the squadron's PB-4Y Liberators. VB-117 states that with Pax River's training and assistance, bombing accuracy was improved appreciably. Tactical Test also took the lead in evaluating captured enemy aircraft. Supported by the Flight Test Division, Tactical Test personnel assessed captured Japanese and German aircraft in order to identify their weaknesses. Such knowledge greatly influenced the advice that Tactical Tests provided to fleet aviators regarding how to optimally employ their own aircraft and weapons in combat. Perhaps surprisingly, Pax River's role in testing captured enemy aircraft was well publicized by June of 1944, as seen in this newspaper article from that time frame. The next division that we'll look at is Radio Test. Despite its name, the Radio Test Division did much more than test aircraft radios. Radio Test came to Pax River from NAS Anacostia in July of 1943 and was actually responsible for testing everything electronic in an aircraft. Today, we call such systems avionics. Before being installed in an aircraft, a communication, navigation, or radar system had first been certified in a contractor or government laboratory. But it was Radio Test's job to ensure that the system performed properly in the aircraft when operated under fleet representative flight conditions. Today, electronics govern every aspect of a military aircraft, from flight controls to sensors to weapons. But during World War II, modern avionics technologies were either unimaginable or, like radar, very immature. As the importance of airborne radar became increasingly clear, these systems came to be the dominant focus of the Radio Test Division. The fourth of Pax River's test divisions was Armament Test. As you can surmise, Armament Test evaluated the performance of weapons attached to or installed in an aircraft. Although rockets, bombs, cannons, and so on were fully certified, it fell to the Armament Test Division to ensure that such weapons could be safely and effectively employed by fleet aviators. A secondary function of Armament Test was to evaluate the aerial targets used to train fleet personnel, along with certain pilotless flying bombs, like the XTD-3R1 drone in this photo. The Armament Test Division came to Pax River from NAS Norfolk in July of 1943. During the war, Armament Test and fleet forces alike took advantage of an array of targets and gunnery ranges that were located just a short flight away from Pax River. For example, the ex-USS San Marcos had been placed off Tangier Island as a target in 1911. In March of 1945, the ex-USS Hannibal became available as a target as well, just off of Smith Island. And Webster Field, just south of the base, had a small range for aerial guns and bombs. The gunnery and bombing ranges at Hooper and Bloodsworth Islands were also heavily used by Armament Test and the fleet. While stationary, all the various ship targets and ranges noted here were nonetheless essential tools for testing gun sites and bomb sites and the accuracy of the weapons themselves. The last of Pax River's 5 wartime test groups was the Service Test Division. Created at Pax River in July of 1944, Service Test used accelerated field testing to evaluate the durability and reliability of new aircraft types. Discovering structural fatigue problems and the like at Pax River enabled corrective actions to be implemented before fleet users experienced an issue. Service Test also validated planned maintenance procedures to ensure they could be executed in a fleet environment. It should be noted that Pax River was far from the only site where Navy and Marine Corps aircraft and airborne systems were tested. In fact, Pax River was just one part of a large nationwide team that collectively advanced naval aviation during World War II. To begin with, every aircraft and system that came to Pax River had first been rigorously evaluated by the contractor that designed and manufactured it. This map denotes only the major prime manufacturers of naval aircraft in World War II. Adding the suppliers of engines, electronic systems, and weapons would fill in much of the map. Beyond Pax River, a number of other government facilities were probably also involved in testing a given aircraft or weapon, or in developing tactics for its use. You can see here some of the organizations that did such work. Fueled by wartime urgency, this massive integrated team developed, tested, and fielded numerous aircraft, weapons, and upgrades in timeframes that seem miraculous by today's standards. Until a few weeks before the end of World War II, the 5 test divisions that we've just discussed were led by Pax River's commanding officer. However, in June of 1945, all 5 divisions were assigned to the commander of a new organization at Pax River. That new group, the Naval Air Test Center, or NATC, remained in place until 1992. In that year, NATC was replaced by the Naval Air Warfare Center Aircraft Division, or NOC-AD. NOC-AD retains leadership today over all developmental test and evaluation functions at Pax River. The need to train new test pilots and flight test engineers was recognized early in Pax River's evolution. After studying the Air Force's test pilot training methodology, the leaders of Pax River's test community began similar training on an informal basis in the spring of 1945. That training was formalized in 1948 under the aegis of a new Test Pilot Training Division, which became the U.S. Naval Test Pilot School in 1957. As we'll see in the next two topics, wartime activity at Pax River entailed much more than flight testing. Pax River was also the headquarters for the Naval Air Transport Service's Atlantic Wing, which owned all Atlantic Fleet air transport squadrons. In June of 1945, that command's presence at Pax River encompassed some 480 officers and 1,775 enlisted personnel. But our focus here is just on one squadron of the Naval Air Transport Service. Air Transport Squadron 1, or VR-1, was based at Pax River from 1943 until 1968. Let's look at VR-1's activities during and after the war. VR-1 came to Pax River from Naval Air Station Norfolk in July 1943, becoming the base's first fleet squadron. At Pax River, the squadron undertook a number of important wartime roles that we'll discuss shortly. Regarding Pax River, though, VR-1's war diary said, quote, "The air station was new, and as yet no permanent barracks had been erected, and consequently there was very little space available for VR-1 personnel. Some of the men were quartered in the temporary barracks referred to by them as Tar Paper Alley, which proved to be equally as uncomfortable in summer as in winter. Morale was at a low ebb." End of quote. As did other Pax River units, VR-1 took full advantage of the base's limited amenities and used sports to help relieve the morale problem. During the war, VR-1 operated two types of transport aircraft. Missions within the U.S. were usually undertaken by the twin-engine Douglas R-4D Skytrain, the Navy's version of the famous C-47. Flights overseas went to the four-engine Douglas R-5D Skymaster. VR-1 was assigned a variety of wartime responsibilities, but the squadron's primary role was to transport combat materiel and military personnel to locations in Europe, Africa, and the Panama Canal Zone. In fulfillment of that mission, VR-1 hauled people, munitions, and cargo in support of the buildups leading to the Allied invasions of Italy and Normandy. But VR-1's wartime missions also included medical evacuation flights, which transported wounded Allied personnel to New York from hostile theaters of operation in Europe and Africa. Additionally, VR-1 played a major role in the training of crews for Navy transport aircraft, adding 181 fully trained R-4D pilots to the fleet. VR-1 also maintained a detachment at Washington National Airport that was frequently used as a transport service for senior Navy officials. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, for example, made 3 trips on VR-1's VIP aircraft, traveling to the European and African theaters of operation, along with Cuba and Bermuda. The National Airport Detachment also allowed Navy personnel to shuttle between Pax River and Washington area military facilities like the Pentagon. The pace of all of VR-1's wartime activities was such that by June of 1945, VR-1's R-5Ds had made 1,000 transatlantic crossings. When the war ended 2 months later, VR-1 was operating 9 R-5Ds and 18 R-4Ds with some 242 pilots aboard. Tragically, during the war, the squadron lost 8 men in 2 fatal mishaps. R-4Ds were involved in both accidents, which occurred in the fall of 1944. After the war, VR-1 became a huge squadron, boasting some 1,100 enlisted men in 1953, along with 170 officers. Although possessing global capabilities, the squadron most often performed its cargo, passenger, and medical transport missions within North America, the Caribbean, North Africa, and Europe. Renamed Tactical Support Squadron 1 in 1957, VR-1 departed PAX in 1968. But before leaving PAX, VR-1 created 2 highly specialized groups that functioned like squadrons within the squadron. The first such group was the Flag Administrative Flight Department, or Zebra Department. Established in 1949, Zebra assumed control of the dedicated VIP aircraft that VR-1 had been operating for 6 years. When VR-1 left Pax River in 1968, the two dedicated Zebra aircraft that it then operated were relocated to Naval Airfield, Washington at Andrews Air Force Base. VR-1 still provides executive transportation services today. In 1964, VR-1 added a second specialized group that performed a strategic communications function called TACAMO. The TACAMO aircraft stayed behind at Pax River when VR-1 left in 1968, and TACAMO remains at Pax today. TACAMO aircraft are capable of issuing launch orders from the President to all of America's nuclear forces. As VR-1 was busy transporting materiel and people in support of the war effort, another Pax River Fleet Squadron, VR-8, was playing the vital role of training flying boat crews. In the Second World War, flying boats were critical to sustaining the Allied invasions of Japanese-held islands. Beyond supplying ammunition, spare parts, food, and other vital material, flying boats also conducted air-sea rescues and attacked ships and submarines. But operating a flying boat requires a specialized set of skills, and proper training is essential. Let's look at the role that Air Transport Squadron 8, or VR-8, played in training pilots and flight crews for these demanding aircraft. In October of 1943, VR-8 was commissioned at Naval Air Station Patuxent River to train crews for flying boats, initially Martin PBM Mariners. VR-8's primary role was to transform crews with little or no seaplane experience and with limited prior instrument training into fleet-ready personnel. But VR-8's first task was to train themselves. When commissioned, VR-8 had just one PBM and only 3 pilots who possessed any seaplane experience at all. Despite those challenges, all VR-8 pilots, flight engineers, and radiomen gained their instructor certifications just in time for the arrival of the first group of students. Those 40 trainees came to Pax River less than a month after VR-8 was commissioned. Scheduling their flight time was a chore, since at that time the squadron had only 5 PBMs, and each of those war-weary aircraft was in constant need of maintenance. In that austere and chaotic environment, VR-8 set itself to work. One of the squadron's first tasks was to provide navigational training for their students. To that end, VR-8 established daily flights to Bermuda, Trinidad, Puerto Rico, and other tropical locations. Beyond the excellent overwater training, such flights also undoubtedly offered a respite from the challenges of operating from an isolated Pax River base with few comforts. Quoting VR-8's war diary, Washington, D.C., the nearest Liberty town, was 60 miles away. Transportation was inadequate, and recreational facilities on the base, still building, were almost nil. The morale problem was ever present, end quote. Like many bases quickly created in World War II, Pax River's amenities centered on sports, of which VR-8 took full advantage. In addition to training PBM crews, VR-8 was also tasked with ferrying PBMs to the West Coast Fleet Squadrons and with hauling cargo and mail. As VR-8 was executing its PBM duties, the squadron was simultaneously evaluating the prototype Martin Mars aircraft that you see in this film clip. In November of 1943, a VR-8 crew set a world record in that massive aircraft, flying 4,375 miles non-stop from Pax River to Natal, Brazil in 29 hours. The Martin Mars test program ended in January of 1944, allowing VR-8 to concentrate exclusively on training PBM crews. A few months later, however, the squadron began to transition from the PBM to the larger consolidated PB-2Y Coronado, and in 1945, as VR-8 trained PB-2Y crews, production Martin Mars aircraft came to Pax River. Supported by sister squadron VR-1, VR-8 was tasked with training crews for the Mars aircraft. VR-8 was also given the additional duties of accepting new Mars aircraft and ferrying them to the fleet. Since VR-8's flying boats lacked landing gear, they could not use Pax River's runways. Fortunately, Pax River had been built with flying boats in mind. For such aircraft, 3 large flying boat basins were created when the base was constructed. They're still visible on this recent photograph of Pax River. These 1944 images depict those flying boat basins during the time frame in which VR-8 was operating. Incidentally, VR-8's aircraft could be moved from the water after being fitted with wheeled fixtures known as beaching gear. Once the beaching gear was attached, the aircraft could be towed up a concrete ramp from the basin and into a hangar. Those 3 basins supported flying boats from Pax River's test community and, of course, VR-8. As noted, VR-8's first aircraft was the twin-engine Martin PBM Mariner. The The squadron operated PBMs from October 1943 until January 1945. Several VR-8 PBMs were in the maritime patrol configuration depicted in this film clip from a different squadron. Maritime patrol PBMs could carry depth bombs and mines and featured a sea search radar. You can see that radar's large antenna on top of the fuselage. VR-8 also operated a number of PBMs in the weaponless transport configuration that you see in this still image. All PBM variants had excellent cargo carrying capability and range. From August of 1944 until the squadron's decommissioning 2 years later, VR-8 trained crews in 2 transport versions of the consolidated PB-2Y Coronado. This photograph depicts the type of aircraft operated by VR-8. Those aircraft were the unarmed versions of the older maritime patrol aircraft that you're about to see in a film clip from another squadron. By the time VR-8 acquired their PB-2Ys, most of the old patrol versions had been stripped down and converted for training or hauling cargo. With 4 engines, PB-2Ys could carry several tons more payload than the smaller PBM. However, the PB-2Ys had only 2/3 the range of the PBM. VR-8 also trained crews in the Martin JRM Mars, doing so from April 1945 until the squadron's 1946 decommissioning. Although the prototype Mars had been designed as a maritime patrol aircraft, the production Mars was strictly a transport plane, and as you can see in this film clip, a huge one at that. The Mars takeoff weight was more than twice that of the PB-2Y, and it had nearly 4 times the PB-2Y's range. Only 6 JRMs were ever built. Each one came to Pax River from the Glen L. Martin factory near Baltimore. At Pax River, VR-8 ensured that each JRM met its contractual requirements, accepted it for the Navy, and then ferried it to the squadron that would place it into operational service. VR-8 did all of this while training crews for both the JRM and the PB-2Y. By the war's end, VR-8 had sent 92 fully trained pilots to the Pacific Theater alone, along with 32 navigators, 100 flight engineers, and 20 radiomen. VR-8's decommissioning in June of 1946 effectively ended Pax River's role as an operational flying boat base. In its time at Pax, the busy squadron never lost an aircraft. Our first 3 topics show that naval aviation in wartime southern Maryland centered on Naval Air Station Patuxent River, much as it does today. However, Pax River's satellite facility, Webster Field, also contributed to America's warfighting effort. From its inception in October of 1943, Webster Field had been little more than an extra set of runways used for practicing carrier landings. But in late 1944, Webster Field found itself playing a role in the Navy's effort to defeat the threat posed by aerial suicide attacks from an increasingly desperate Japanese Navy. Defeating this new threat placed a priority on anti-aircraft gunner training. Navy utility squadrons, which provided pilotless aerial targets for such training, found their services in high demand. Let's look at one of those squadrons, VJ-5, which operated target drones from Webster Field in 1945. During World War II, Utility Squadron 5, or VJ-5, was headquartered in Naval Air Station Cape May, New Jersey. VJ-5 regularly sent small teams with remotely piloted target drones to various East Coast locations where anti-aircraft gunners trained on ships before going to war. In the first 6 months of 1945, VJ-5 made 3 trips from New Jersey to Webster Field. Each deployment lasted a week or so. At Webster Field, VJ-5 operated Culver TD-2C-1 target drones, identical to the one you saw in the film clip and see in this image. VJ-5's war diary suggests they took a dim view of their temporary Webster Field home. Quoting the report, in the way of accommodations for transients, Webster Field, Maryland had practically nothing available. The duty crew managed to establish themselves, not too comfortably, in a nearby aged structure once known as a farmhouse. Recreation in town consisted of a movie house and the usual beer parlors. The latest available film dated back to the perils of Pauline. The surroundings were comparable to the film shown. End of quote. Over the Chesapeake Bay, VJ-5 remotely flew their target drones against the gunners of a training ship, the USS Wyoming. Wyoming's trainees shot at the drones, gaining valuable live fire experience before being sent to the fleet. At Webster Field, VJ-5 operated the TD-2C-1s in ways that replicated the kamikaze techniques that were wreaking havoc in the Pacific. Let's look a bit more closely at the Culver TD-2C-1 target drone, which was nicknamed Turkey, and the USS Wyoming as well. TD-2C-1s were derived from a civilian sport plane. This allowed VJ-5 to fly their drones from Cape May to Webster Field using onboard pilots. In their 3 trips to Webster Field, VJ-5 took as many as 8 TD-2Cs with them. Obviously, no operator was aboard when a target drone was being shot at. Instead, the drone was remotely controlled by a pilot inside a modified JRB-1 like the one in the upper photo. The drone controller was positioned in a windowed cupola above the flight deck. The USS Wyoming was commissioned as a battleship in 1912. After Pearl Harbor, Wyoming was converted into a gunnery training ship. In that role, Wyoming served in the Chesapeake Bay until the end of the war, becoming known as the Chesapeake Raider. Wyoming trained 35,000 gunners on 7 different types of guns. We've already discussed 2 large Navy ships that operated in the Chesapeake Bay. Those ships, the Wyoming and the Charger, generally plied the waters to our south. But you'd be mistaken in thinking that Navy vessels were restricted from our part of the Chesapeake. In fact, many Navy ships of various types operated right off the shores of Calvert County, near the Navy Research Laboratory's Chesapeake Beach Annex. There, NRL calibrated the ship's radars, radios, and radar detection equipment before the ships headed to a war zone. Flashing on the screen are photos of just some of the submarines, destroyers, and other Navy ships that were tested near NRL's Chesapeake Beach Annex. Perhaps the most famous ship to visit southern Maryland was the USS Missouri, which came here in August of 1944. Almost exactly 1 year later, the documents ending the Second World War were signed on her deck. Research is continuing as to what support was provided during the war to NRL by Pax River and Webster Field. VJ-5's last trip to Webster Field was in June of 1945. Over the following 10 years or so, Webster Field did again support gunnery training on occasion. However, such training was no longer focused on ship's gunners, but rather on fighter pilots. This 1952 photo, taken at Webster Field, illustrates. In the background is a General Motors TBM Avenger from a Pax River unit, Fleet Air Service Squadron 5-2. That TBM is equipped with an aerial target that will be deployed in flight at the end of a very long cable. In the foreground, running up, are F-8F Bearcats from Marine Reserve Squadron VMF 321. Those Bearcats are about to fly over the Chesapeake Bay, where they will make gunnery runs against a target being towed by the TBM. In the 4 decades after the war, Webster Field was far more commonly used by pilots simulating aircraft carrier landings. Pilots from both Pax River and Fleet Squadrons use Webster Field for Field Carrier Landing Practice, or FCLPs. Beginning in the mid-1980s, Webster Field experienced a dramatic increase in flying activity. Unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs, returned to Webster Field some 40 years after drones last flew there. In 1986, a detachment of Composite Squadron 6 was stationed at Webster Field. The VC-6 detachment developed, tested, and fielded a broad range of unmanned aerial vehicles. In this clip from Operation Desert Storm, you can see an Iraqi unit actually surrendering to a Pioneer UAV from VC-6. 10 years after VC-6's 2008 disestablishment, a new squadron, UX-24, was commissioned at Webster Field. Much like VC-6 in the past, UX-24 today tests and evaluates a number of UAVs for the Navy and Marine Corps. UAV-related work is expected to remain a core business of Webster Field. Like Pax River and Webster Field, Solomons, Maryland also contributed to Naval Aviation's wartime activities in our region. During the war's latter stages, blimps based at Solomon supported torpedo testing at Piney Point. In 1940, the U.S. Naval Torpedo Test Range at Piney Point began daily operations, part of a Navy program to prove out every torpedo delivered to the fleet. Let's look at how blimps from Solomon supported Piney Point. Most of the torpedoes tested by Piney Point during World War II were produced in Alexandria, Virginia, some 90 miles away. The photo depicts the barge YTT-4, which sent torpedoes from Piney Point down a 13-mile range on the Potomac River. Tested without explosives and recovered after the run, a torpedo that ran true and at the proper depth was sent on to an operational unit. A torpedo exhibiting problems at Piney Point was generally sent back to Alexandria for rework. From November of 1944 through October of 1945, Navy G-class blimps supported Piney Point from the Naval Mine Warfare Test Station in Solomons, Maryland. The Mine Warfare Test Station was several miles north of Piney Point and just across the river from Naval Air Station Patuxent River. Blimp crews from Solomons were tasked with locating torpedoes at the end of their test runs. As you'll see, a blimp positioned downrange would direct a boat to retrieve each torpedo. For testing, torpedoes were inert and configured to float to the surface when their compressed air propellant was expended. As you watch this, keep in mind that at any given time, only 1 or 2 blimps were detached to Solomons. However, from the fall of 1944 through the fall of 1945, 6 of the Navy's 8 G-class blimps rotated through Solomons from their base at Naval Air Station Lakehurst, New Jersey. The use of blimps for torpedo spotting at test ranges like Piney Point was efficient but unusual. During World War II, fixed-wing aircraft and boats were more commonly used to find torpedoes at the end of their test runs. However, the Solomons airships didn't just support Piney Point. Those blimps also observed and photographed tests conducted from the Solomons Mine Warfare Test Station. One of the many vessels used in such testing is depicted here. The blimps left Solomons in October of 1945, returning to their Lakehurst, New Jersey home base. The G-class blimps at Solomons were detached from a squadron at Naval Air Station Lakehurst, New Jersey. Prior to coming to Solomons, the blimps had been used to train airship crews and, briefly, to support torpedo testing off New York's Long Island. If you're wondering what happened after the Piney Point torpedo range closed in 1954, well, its former shore facilities are today spread between the New Star Terminal and the Paul Hall Center for Maritime Training and Education. But what about the Solomons, Maryland site where the blimps were based? During World War II, the Navy actually ran 2 facilities in Solomons, Maryland. On the map, the Mine Warfare Test Station that we've been discussing is to the west. To the east of the test station is a separate amphibious training base that we haven't discussed. The Mine Warfare Test Station had a 4-decade life over which it underwent a number of changes in names and missions. Today, that station's former land is the site of a Navy recreation center and a Navy-controlled industrial area. The amphibious training base at Solomons was in operation for just 3 years, but in that brief period of time, the base trained over 67,000 officers and men for 2 Allied invasions. Today, it's a private marina. No operational airships have deployed to southern Maryland since 1945. However, over the last few decades, several experimental blimps and aerostats, like the MZ-3A on the screen, have been tested at the Naval Air Station Patuxent River and at Webster Field. In the Second World War, aviation transformed the U.S. Navy into a global force. Naval aviation was born from the skill of engineers and factory workers who designed and built the aircraft of war. Naval aviation was nurtured in places like southern Maryland, where those aircraft were tested and used to train the men who would go to war and to bring home the wounded who had been to war. And ultimately, naval aviation was made dominant by those who flew into hostile skies and who, in too many cases, never returned home to enjoy the freedoms that their sacrifices preserved. Today, those of us fortunate enough to live in southern Maryland should be proud of the role that our region played in World War II, and we should remember the sacrifices that made victory possible. Our mission at the Pax River Naval Air Museum is to preserve southern Maryland's naval aviation history and to educate and inspire folks about that history, which is still being made here today. Thanks for watching.
That was pretty impressive and informative. Bob, what challenges did you face in compiling both the information and the images that we just saw in that movie?
Well, you can probably imagine the biggest challenge that we have right now in 2020 when I generated this was the fact that the war ended 75 years ago. A lot of the folks with first-hand knowledge of what was happening here in southern Maryland during those years are no longer with us. And sadly, a lot of their first-hand insights into that period of time, the history, died with them. So that's the biggest single challenge, I think, to putting a film like this together. On the plus side, though, we live in the internet era. There's a lot of information available online, sometimes for a fee. Original Navy files, records, reports, and so on, which facilitate the job of telling us the who, what, where, when sort of things To add flesh to that skeleton, though, that's the real challenge. For that purpose, I try to go with contemporaneous periodicals, newspapers, other publications, whatever information I can get my hands on that help to add a little color and a little meat to the bones. But there's still challenges, obviously, in trying to put that information together because so much of that original source material has not yet been digitized, and that lends itself to maybe some challenges. In terms of videos and images, we live in the internet era again, so we have a tremendous amount of Navy imagery, videos, and so on that have been digitized over the years that is now publicly accessible. If we were to have tried to have done this 30 years ago, it would have been very, very challenging. You would have had to have gone to the places where that data is located.
Sure. And
then made copies and then digitized it yourself or put it in a medium where you could actually use it for a film of this kind. That's a challenge that we don't have to face today, thankfully.
Sure.
I will say that some of the imagery that we just saw, some of the videos we just saw, is not of the highest quality, and I'm sure that some of the viewers can recognize the fact that when you're looking at something that took place 75 nigh on years ago, it can be daunting to try to find something that's both pertinent to the story that I'm trying to tell and that has the requisite quality. I've tried to do as good a job as I could of assembling those bits of information and images and so on that help convey the story that I'm trying to relate.
I note also that you called out when you were using images that were not related to the Naval Air Station here, so assuming that all the others were.
That's, to the best of my knowledge, yeah. Sometimes the source of some of those images can be a little bit challenging, but piecing together metadata, you can normally narrow a particular airplane on a screen down to either this base or to a unit that was here in this period of time. Mm-hmm. And where I don't have that kind of certainty, I have tried to point out and say, no, this is from another unit.
Good, good. In this talk, in your earlier talk for the Historical Society on the Pax River's Forgotten Cold Warriors, you mentioned the TACAMO Strategic Communications Detachment, which remains at Pax River today. Mm-hmm. For those of us who may have missed the earlier presentation, could you describe briefly what TACAMO is all about?
Yeah, absolutely. TACAMO is one of those vestiges of the Cold War that's still with us. TACAMO is an acronym. It stands for Take Charge and Move Out, and I'll explain where that came from. But it has its origins in the need to have a mechanism for communicating presidential commands to the nuclear missile forces and the nuclear bomber forces. And particularly, if we go back now to the 1960 timeframe, it has its origins in something called Project Looking Glass. Project Looking Glass was the Air Force's program, which was in place for a number of years, a number of decades actually, to try to supplement the ground-based communication systems that the president would use to tell an ICBM bunker to go launch a nuclear war, mm-hmm. to supplement those ground-based systems with an airborne system, an airplane full of very senior Air Force personnel who would have the authority to take that presidential directive and relay it to bomber forces and ICBM forces. Looking Glass was in operation, flying around 24/7 for several decades. The problem with Looking Glass was, not that it was an Air Force program, but it could only talk to the ICBMs, it could only talk to the bombers, it could not talk to submerged submarines. The third leg of the nuclear triad is those submerged ballistic missile submarines. So after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Navy took on as a matter of urgency filling that gap and directed the commander of the Naval Air Development Center up in Warminster, Pennsylvania, gave him a very urgent direction to come up with an airplane like Looking Glass that could talk to submerged nuclear missile submarines. He wrote in the margins, the Admiral did, on the margins of his note to the commander of the Naval Air Development Center, the words "take charge and move out" to convey that sense of urgency. Yep. That was compelling enough that they used those words, take charge and move out, made an acronym out of it, TACAMO, and applied that to the program that they then developed. Now we fast forward to 2020. TACAMO is a success. We do have the capability with these airplanes that are based here to talk to and to convey presidential launch direction to these nuclear submerged submarines. And now these TACAMO aircraft on base can, in fact, act as Looking Glass platforms, so they can talk to all three legs of the triad, the submarines, the ICBMs, and the bombers.
Terrific. Well, we hope you enjoyed Bob's film. It will be available here at the museum as well. And if you have questions, please don't hesitate to contact Bob at the museum or through the Historical Society as well. Once again, thank you for joining us.